Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. Thank you very much for coming and for the invitation. I'll be talking today about attachment and child development from myths to modern neuroscience. Now, I don't have to remind you probably, or hopefully, that currently attachment is really everywhere, right? So we read about attachment every day, several times on social media. Parenting books are full of considerations of attachment. Even TV shows these days have lots of content on attachment. And attachment, of course, is part of many official guidelines, you know, for kindergartens, for pediatricians, for many different kinds of people. And we also should be aware that attachment also is present in quite a few scientific domains, most prominently in developmental psychology, where attachment theory originates, but also in social psychology that is related or concerned with adult relationships. It's also very prominent in psychotherapy and psychiatry, and it's also being discussed in child welfare settings. You know, for example, if parents divorce, what is the best possible outcome for children? And this omnipresence of attachment on one hand is really nice because it is a very important concept that keeps being important throughout the entire lifespan. However, being so omnipresent also comes with a few issues. And one of these issues is that, unfortunately, during the last couple of years or decades, attachment terminology has become inconsistent and confusing. So we are nowadays literally lost in translation when we talk about attachment because many different people refer to the same processes using different terms or the other way around. What also happened is that, of course, if more and more people start to use psychology, some of the core principles are becoming oversimplified or diluted. And we see this because there is lots of pop psychology accounts of attachment these days, where things are not necessarily always wrong or misleading, but they always, mostly or very often miss a few very important details. And finally, of course, we want to give advice to parents, to practitioners, to many people about how to best raise a child. But unfortunately, although this advice is many times well-intended, it is often extremely prescriptive, unhelpful, and sometimes even harmful in that it stresses out parents. And of course, if parents are stressed, they are not that well equipped to provide care, adequate care to their children. So what can we do and how can we address this? And so I have a little plan for today in which I want to address these things and give a few helpful recommendations. So first of all, every now and then in my talk you will see this very fancy unicorn here, with which I would like to do some myth busting, right? So I would like to explain some of the most prominent myths surrounding attachment, theory and science, and provide some more accurate and up-to-date explanations. And I want to do this by referring to attachment science, because in the last 20 years, attachment science has been giving us lots of new insights, not only into the behavior, but also into the neurobiology of attachment and caregiving, especially within our framework of the social neuroscience of human attachment, or SO-NEAT in its abbreviation. So I will refer to these findings every now and then. And finally, I would like to provide some practical advice that we developed together with the UK charity Baby Grow, and particularly with its founder and managing director, Dr. Amanda Lucas, who was a developmental psychologist and a lecturer first, and then opened or formed the charity. And there I would like to refer to our program, which is called CHATS, which looks at cues, history, attachment, talk, and synchrony. And I would like to point out a few things that are part of CHATS. And if you want to look up CHATS, please feel free to go to the Baby Grow website. We have a Baby Grow book, which is freely available for download. We are also offering continuous professional training. So feel free to check out my website. Also for the myth busting, there are 27 posts currently, and the list is steadily growing. Okay. But let's do first things first, right? So let's start at the basics, and let's ask the question, what actually is attachment? And to answer this question, I would like to refer to this paper that we wrote not too long ago together with my very good colleagues Melanie Kungel and Lars White, who are two professors in Germany. And in that paper, we basically summarize our perception of attachment with this very intuitive diagram here, right? You can just have a look, and in 10 seconds, you understand everything, right? So it's actually not the case, and to be honest, I don't even understand everything myself. So I will try to break this down a little bit for the talk today. So what do we think currently is the most important scientific concept underlying attachment? And we think that it's basically what is depicted here, how we can keep our balance. And this involves two processes. One is homeostasis and one is allostasis. And so what does this mean? One of our main tasks that our brain and body have to do constantly is to keep our balance. And this balance has very narrow limits and works in short time frames, right? So it's our temperature regulation, it's our food intake, and these have narrow limits, right? The optimal temperature is around 37 degrees, and if we have already only 38 degrees, that's already an issue. But usually this keeping our balance, keeping homeostasis works pretty automatically. We don't really have to think about it too much, right? I don't have to think, oh, now I need to cool down my body. Usually the body does it by itself. However, every now and then, we face a significant challenge, like me standing here in front of so many people in a foreign country. So I'm a bit more nervous, right? My heart rate goes up, my blood pressure goes up. And so I need to do something a bit more conscious, a bit more voluntary to regulate myself. I have to tell myself, oh, it's all going to be fine. The audience is very friendly. I don't have to worry about anything. We are all friends here, right? And so this is something that we need to do more actively, and this is called allostasis, returning to homeostasis, returning to the balance through some active change. But this is only one part of allostasis. The other part of allostasis is to predict, right? So if I predict that I'll be giving a similar talk maybe in the future, depending on how it goes today, I will then predict how it will go the next time. And if today it goes really well, which I hope, touch wood, then of course I'll be more calm and more relaxed when I give the talk in the future. And so I don't have to upregulate my physiology already before I start. I can come in and be relaxed and have a better time. Right, but how does this now link to attachment? Well, the thing is that keeping our homeostasis and performing allostasis, it takes energy, right? It's something that the body needs fuel for. And this fuel has to come from somewhere. And we can provide this fuel up to a certain extent by ourselves, but only up to a certain extent. And especially for infants, for young children, this is very difficult because they don't have that much fuel. They don't have that many cognitive resources by themselves. And so they depend on others to give them the energy to perform homeostasis, to keep homeostasis, and to perform allostasis. And in that sense, we are not talking only about allostasis, but we are talking about social allostasis. So we are making use of other people's resources to regulate our own emotions, to regulate our own physiology, to regulate our own psychology. And of course, again, this is not only about regulation in the current, in the present, it's about regulation in the future, right? Do I think that if I need help from somebody else in the future, is that person going to be available or not? Am I going to have an efficient strategy to elicit help? Because if I'm already distressed and I need to put in a lot of energy to get help from somebody else, that's probably not that efficient, right? Because it uses even more of my energy. So we are also talking about social allostasis in the way of predicting how much somebody else will be available to help me in the future and how efficient that help will be and how efficient I'll be able to get that help. And that's exactly when we start talking about attachment, right? Because secure attachment is nothing else than a mental representation of others as available and responsive. If I need help, I have the efficient strategies to elicit that help, and I can then make use of others' resources for co-regulation. And that's nothing else than the representation of a secure attachment. Now, if we have the scenario of an avoidant attachment, we have different mental representations, right? We think that others are not really that available, and they might even be unresponsible. And so if I want to ask help, it's probably not the best idea to help such people to whom I have an avoidant attachment to, because eliciting help is going to be hard and inefficient. And therefore, it's better if I rely on myself and use self-regulation more regularly. And that's why we call attachment avoidance also individual fight, right? Because I stand up by myself and I punch the challenge in the face, right? And finally, we have attachment anxiety, where I think about others in the sense that it's difficult to predict them. You know, sometimes if I ask them for help, they are very responsive. They will help me a lot. But at other times, when I do exactly the same thing, they will not react or they will reject me. So it's really difficult to predict whether that person is going to help or not. And my strategy, therefore, to get help will also be unreliable, because if I use the same strategy 10 times, only 4 times I will get help, and 6 times I won't. So I will start doubting my strategy. But I still want to get help from them, and therefore I will shout for help even louder. And that's why we call this also social flight, right? And so attachment styles are nothing else than strategies to regulate, either more by relying on others or more regulating by myself. And then we also have disorganized, fearful, avoidant, or unresolved attachment. But I won't talk about these too much today because they are a little bit complicated. Disorganized attachment should only be mentioned in childhood, and fearful, avoidant, and unresolved attachment are in adulthood, but they are usually assessed with different methodologies, so I'll leave this aside. Now, if we consider those 3 attachment styles one more time, what is really important and what I would like to stress today is that all of these styles are important, appropriate, and meaningful. They are all necessary adaptations to specific environmental demands. So no attachment style is intrinsically good or bad, or weak or strong, right? With certain people in certain situations, it's better to actually have a slightly avoidant attachment, because with them a secure attachment wouldn't actually work. With other people, it's maybe better to have an anxious attachment at some point, right? So, and because we have many different attachments at the same time and they have different qualities, so we should refrain from saying secure attachment is good, insecure attachment is bad, so we shouldn't see this in a black or white kind of perspective. Now, that said, we shouldn't forget, of course, that some attachment styles come with more risks than others, right? And so the insecure attachment styles, of course, they are linked to certain risks. And the biggest risk is indicated here at the bottom left. It's allostasis overload, right? Because for the insecure attachment strategies, we either have to use lots of our own resources, or we don't reliably get help from others. And this can then lead in the long term to what we call allostasis overload, that we have to keep regulating ourselves, and that at some point we just run out of energy, and that's where we start having mental health issues, physical health issues. So their insecure attachment absolutely, of course, becomes a risk factor. But it's quite a long way until we get there, and we shouldn't see attachment initially or generally speaking as good or bad, okay? Right. And what is also important is that insecure attachment and the other disorganized and unresolved attachments, they are not clinical diagnoses or disorders. We will hear more about this in the last talk. But just to point this out now, that there are some attachment disorders that can be diagnosed in children, but they need very specific criteria, and insecure attachment by itself is not a clinical diagnosis. It's just a personality style. It's just a way of seeking support and dealing with social relationships, right? So again, insecure attachment is not bad, and it's not a disorder. If I have an insecure attachment with somebody, it doesn't mean that I have a huge problem and that I need to see a psychiatrist to get fixed, right? It's not how this works. All right. So far we have looked at what attachment is, and now I would like to go a little bit further, and I would like to ask 2 questions, of which the first one is, how do attachment styles arise? And here I would like to go to our social neuroscience of human attachment to give you some ideas of our latest theory about attachment. And here I would like to move to a concept that we formulated a couple years ago where we look at what kind of interaction components a prototypical attachment interaction comprises. And we did this together with a set of people, with Madison, who was a master's student at the time, and two of my very good colleagues, Wilhelm Verbeke and Zachi Eindor. And as for the first paper, we again summarized this very intuitively in a very simple diagram that everybody can see, especially those people in the back, right? So again, I would like to break this a little bit up and make it more accessible and make it also a little bit more visual. So we think that a prototypical attachment interaction comprises 6 main components. And so, as I said before, initially or usually, everything is fine, we are in a balance, right? We are in our state of homeostasis, nothing is really bothering us, our body works really well, everything is fine. But then something happens. Something can happen externally, right? We can hear a fire alarm, for example, that kind of induces a threat response. Or we can start thinking about something, a memory that makes us feel sad, or think about something that happens tomorrow and that makes us already nervous, and that leads to a homeostasis disruption. And usually these events are negative, right? They are a threat to our physiology or to our mental, our internal representations. And so they, of course, initiate a threat detection and a fear response. And they then activate the brain regions that we have already heard about in the saliency network, right? Because this just tells our body that, oh, there is something happening, something important happening that needs our attention. And we can call this a saliency network, but we also call this the aversion module, right? Because it processes aversive states or stimuli or information. And for many people, kind of an attachment interaction stops here, but there are still many components that come. And the next component is extremely important, namely, this is the component that says, okay, if I feel threatened, if I am fearful, what do I do? My primary attachment strategy is to seek help from others. And how does that work? So I need to develop a pro-social motivation to seek help from somebody else. And this is what we link to this approach module or this connection module, right? So I need to develop a motivation, also biologically speaking, to approach others. And this is maintained in those areas that are importantly related to reward. There is dopamine, there's oxytocin, but there are many other neurohormones involved as well. Now, if my support seeking is successful, if I can elicit help from somebody else, then social allostasis kicks in, right? Co-regulation kicks in. I have somebody who is close, and I can make use of those person's resources to regulate my fear, my stress, my threat response. In infants, this usually works through close physical proximity, right? But the more often children experience co-regulation, the more they can then start developing self-regulation. And later on in life, there usually is an optimum balance between self-regulation and co-regulation, right? So I'm able to regulate myself, but I'm still willing to seek help from others. And we link this to an emotion regulation network, which we also have already seen in terms of the emotion executive functioning network, right? So that's involved in regulation, attention, task switching, and so on and so forth. And so what happens now? I established approach to a person. I got co-regulated from that person. So the next thing is my body calms down. The fear response goes away. I return to the balance. And this feels good by itself, right? My heart is no longer racing. My blood pressure drops. I stop sweating. It feels good, physically speaking. But the key is here that this physically feel-good feeling is now linked to being together with another person, right? So I start associating being together with that person with a rewarding experience. And that will make me then, in the future, to seek closeness to that person again and again, because it makes me feel good. So the approach module kicks in one more time. And finally, if this sequence keeps happening over and over again in the same predictable, consistent way, I will then start to build predictions and expectations, okay? If I feel bad, what can I do to elicit help from a certain person? What will this person do to me. And hopefully, I can build positive mental representations of myself and others because I can learn I have efficient strategies to elicit help, and other people will be helpful, right? And these are nothing else than the internal working models of attachment. And we link this to a mental state representation module or a default mode network activity. And there will now be all of these representations of different people to whom I can have different attachments, right? And I can also represent different strategies, strategy A for person A, strategy B for person B, and so on and so forth. And so what we can see from this sequence is, a bit more myth-busting, that attachment is not just about fear. It's not just about stress, right? This is usually the first component of attachment because stress, fear initiates attachment behavior. But it's only the beginning, and there are many, many different other components that are important. And so attachment is not only about fear, it's about a reward, it's about regulation, it's about co-regulation, it's about mental state representations, right? So it's much more than just fear. And this is also, of course, represented in on the level of the brain. So if we now shuffle this a little bit, so this is our functional neuroanatomical model of human attachment. And so we can see on the left, we have two more emotional, affective, more intuitive modules. And on the right, we have the more cognitive, control, mentalization kind of active modules. But what is crucial is the balance between those four, right? We need all of them. We need all of them at the same time, but they need to be in a good balance. We shouldn't only go into one and kind of neglect the others because then our responses become rigid and not so well appropriate to the circumstances. So again, attachment is everywhere. It's not only everywhere in the social media and on books, it's also everywhere in the brain, right? There is no single region for attachment. There is no single network for attachment. Attachment is everywhere in the brain. It recruits areas that do many different things, that do things that are completely attachment unrelated, but it also recruits them for attachment behavior. What we also can see is that attachment is very multifaceted, right? So it involves threat, fear, negative emotions, but it also involves positive emotions, regulation, mentalization. So many, many different processes, many different brain regions. And finally, attachment is dynamic, right? So attachment depends on constant readjustment across these networks, and that's indicated with these arrows, push-pull, right? That there's a constant dynamic between sometimes more aversion module, sometimes more regulation module activity, sometimes more approach, sometimes more mental state. And it's a constant balance that needs to work well, especially if we think about secure attachment. Because insecure attachment usually is linked to the changes in this dynamic, right? That we shift a little bit more towards aversion, we shift a little bit too much to approach, a little bit too much or too little to regulation. And we can see this when we do brain imaging in children, adolescents, adults, as we see restructuring of these networks, not only in functionality, but also in the structure itself. Just to mention two myths that are quite prominent here in terms of attachment and the brain. The first one is that attachment is right brain centered. I'm not sure whether you have come across this, but I hear this quite a lot when I talk to people. And this basically means that there has been this theory put forward in the 1950s that we as people are either left-brained or right-brained, okay? So if we are left-brained, we are more logical, we are more analytic, we like facts, we like maths, right? But if we are right-brained, we are more creative, we are more emotional, we are more imaginatory, right? And then, of course, if we think about attachment, what is attachment? It's emotional, it's intuitive, right? So it's related to feelings, imaginations. So yeah, of course, attachment is in the right brain. But that's actually a myth, right? So there is lots of new research showing in thousands of participants that for complex behavioral traits, for complex processes, there is no left versus right brain lateralization. Attachment is everywhere in the brain, and especially in psychotherapy, we shouldn't have the idea that there needs to be a magical connection between the right brain of the psychotherapist and the right brain of the client, when we work with attachment. That's not how psychotherapy of attachment works. The second myth is related to the so-called triune brain model. And what is that? That's another myth that says that the brain consists of three main structures, and that these structures are independent and hierarchically organized. So we have a first very primitive structure in yellow, which is the reptilian brain or the lizard brain, because already lizards have this brain area. And this is all the automatic processes, right? Breathing and digestion and sleeping. And then we have a second layer on top, which is the mammalian brain. So we are already moving a bit up in evolution, right? This is something mammals have. That's more focused with memory and emotion and feelings. And finally, we have the human brain, the neocortex, right? Which is the most complicated area. And if we look at this, then very often people say attachment is in the reptilian brain or in the mammalian brain because it's automatic and it's intuitive. But it's a bit animal-like, right? We don't have too much power over it, and it just overcomes us. And sometimes, especially if we are insecurely attached, we regress to some animal states, less human states. And that's, of course, not really nice, right? Because as I've said before, attachment is everywhere in the brain, and all of these modules are very important. And none of them is good or bad. None of them is more animal-like or more human-like. They are all very important. Negative feelings, threat is very important. But also mentalization control is important. What is really the key is the balance, right? And sometimes also people say that the human brain develops from the inside out, so that infants are first more animal-like. They don't really know what they are doing. And that's, of course, also not really nice, because infants, they have strategies from the beginning. They form attachment strategies from the very start, very early on, and these strategies are useful, and we as parents and caregivers have to respond to these strategies by giving them meaning and not just saying, oh, now it's just a little lizard here and nothing is really happening or important, right? So that's quite derogatory, and we shouldn't be approaching it from that way. So we have learned a little bit about how attachment styles arise. And now I would like to switch to the last question of today. What can we do to foster secure attachment in children? And we have already heard a little bit about that in the first talk, right? But I would like to expand on this during the last 10 or so minutes. And so I would like to try to give you a little bit of practical advice. And as I said before, I would like to base this practical advice on our CHATS model that we developed together with the charity Baby Grow. And what we basically do there is we take our functional neuroanatomical model of human attachment, and we ask the question, what can we as parents, as caregivers do to ensure that these modules, the balance between these modules develops in the best way possible, right, in children, in infants. And, well, I have to disappoint you a little bit, unfortunately, here, because I can't give you very easy parenting hacks, right? I can't give you a list of 10 things and say that if you do these 10 things from now on, your child will, the development of your child will be optimal, and your child will guaranteed develop a secure attachment to you, right? I can't say that, and I don't really want to say that, because this just doesn't exist. Because every child-parent attachment bond is unique, right? If you have 2 or 3 children, you know that, right? And also each child-parent interaction is different. If I do something with my child today and it works really, really well, I can do the same thing tomorrow, but it doesn't work at all, right? Because the child didn't sleep well or something else happened. So it's useless to give you a list of 10 things, because circumstances change all the time. And what we should also be aware here is maybe of this fact. There is a parenting philosophy out there which is called attachment parenting. And because it has attachment in its name, it might lead you to think that it's actually based on attachment theory. But it is not. So attachment parenting was developed in the 1980s by 2 US pediatricians, completely independently from attachment theory that was developed decades earlier by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, right? And attachment parenting is also very prescriptive. They have this list of baby Bs, right? You have to establish attachment very early, very soon after birth. The first hours and days are extremely important, and if you don't do it right then your child will have issues. They give very prescriptive advice on breastfeeding, on co-sleeping, right? And as I just said before, this might work for some parents, but it might not work for many other parents, right? For example, the mother will have difficulties breastfeeding. And if we tell her, well, if you don't breastfeed your child will have an insecure attachment to you, this puts a lot of pressure on the mothers, right? And that's just unfair. Because, for example, also for me as a father, if I can actually bottle feed my child, I have a very good time with my child where I can bond, right? So again, we shouldn't be this prescriptive. But, well, what can we do then? And so what I would like to provide you with are a few general principles that have been shown repeatedly to actually work. And the first one is the first component of our chats. It's related to infants' cues. So how parents respond to infants' cues. And ideally, they respond swiftly, consistently, appropriately, and sensitively. And this relates to the concept of parental sensitivity. And we have already heard about this in the first talk, which is one of the most reliable predictors of secure attachment formation in infants. So parental sensitivity relates to recognizing and understanding children's verbal and nonverbal cues and responding in a way that provides comfort, support, and reassurance. But of course, right, comfort, support, and reassurance is different for every child. It's different for every interaction. So again, I can't tell you this is always comforting or this is always supportive, right? Parents have to figure this out by themselves. What is supportive for my child right now, and what is supportive for my child, for my other child right now, and so on and so forth. The second thing that is also comprised in cues is how parents reflect upon children's mental experiences to give meaning to their behavior, their own experience as caregivers, and the interdependence between the child behavior and the parent behavior. And this is something that is called parental reflective functioning. And this is another quite robust predictor of a secure infant attachment. Because if parents understand that their children have mental states, you know, that if they cry, they're not just crying because they want to cry and make parents angry, but because they actually cry because they have a need, right? So that maybe they are frustrated, they are tired, they are hungry. And that's why they are crying. And so the parents, if they can represent their children's behavior as meaningful, having desires and intentions and beliefs, they will respond differently to these children, right? They will refrain from becoming angry, for example, if they cry, because they know, oh, if my child cries, it's actually, they want to tell me something. They're not doing it just to upset me, right? And finally, and additionally, what is also really important is the second component. It's the age. It's the caregiver's own attachment history, right? So parents, ideally, before they have children, will reflect upon their own upbringing, okay? What was my relationship with my parents? How was my parents' caregiving? What did that make me feel? How is my attachment to my parents? Because we know that attachment and caregiving are strongly linked, right? Also in the brain, they are two complementary networks in the brain, but they are not the same, right? And so if I have a certain attachment style, I will also have a certain caregiving style, and so on and so forth. And very recently, we looked into these three components together with a team of researchers from Germany. You might already know some of them, right? Melanie, Sandra, Gottfried, and Lars. And we saw that in adults, there is a strong correlation between their own attachment history, their reflective functioning, and their sensitivity, how they respond to their children. And usually this is positively correlated, right? So if the parents have more secure attachment representations themselves, they have higher reflective functioning, and they are also more sensitive to their children. And here we could actually show that if the parents are avoidantly attached, if they have avoidant attachment representations, they have less parental reflective functioning, and therefore they have less sensitivity when they interact with their children. The next point is talk. And so what also helps is if parents label, narrate, and explain the thoughts and feelings that their children have, right? So I see that you're upset. I see that you're crying. Is it because you are tired? Or is it because your toy is broken, right? And this helps children to make sense of their own feelings. And it also helps them to already get a few regulation strategies, right? Because labeling emotions by itself is already a reappraisal strategy. And finally, I would like to switch to synchrony, which is the last part of chats and which is the most recent research aspect that we have added to our repertoire. So synchrony refers to the coordination and attunement of behavior and physiology during interaction. And this has been coined by Ruth Feldman as biobehavioral synchrony. So it's the attunement of the behavior, of the physiology, of the endocrinology, and of the brain activity. And it is a crucial component for self-regulation and co-regulation associated with the secure attachment. And here we have done quite a lot of research recently, again with my team of researchers, especially Chin, Steffi, Lars, and Melanie. And we do this with so-called functional near-infrared spectroscopy hyperscanning. So we invite the parents and the children to the lab. They usually come in pairs, dad with a child, mom with a child, and they play puzzles together. And we are especially interested in the condition where they play puzzles collaboratively, where we give them one puzzle and they have to solve it together. And then we measure brain activity in the parent and the child at the same time. And what we usually find is that when they play the puzzle together, as when they compared to when they play the puzzle independently, there is more brain-to-brain synchrony and there is more behavioral synchrony in those dyads. So synchrony is actually good for the interaction. However, there are quite interesting sex differences. So when we look at the father-child interaction, we see that in the behavior, they are not that synchronized to one another, right? The mothers and the children are more synchronized in their behavior. There is more reciprocity, there is more turn-taking. However, in the brain, it's exactly the opposite. In the brain, dads have more synchrony with their children as compared to moms with their children. And we therefore think that, because in the behavior, the dads and the children are not that much in sync, so their brains actually have to work a bit harder, right? They have to think a bit harder what the other person is going to do next. They have to regulate a little bit more. That's why the synchrony is a little bit higher. And therefore, more synchrony in the brain might actually be an indication of a slight problem in the interaction on the behavioral level. And finally, we also see that there is more synchrony in the mother-child dyads when the mothers have insecure attachment representations. And this, again, is a little bit counterintuitive, right? But it could also, again, be a compensation mechanism. So the more, because if the attachment of the mother is insecure, then she might have a little bit more problem interacting with the child, and the child might have a little bit more problem interacting with the mom. So, 2 more myth bustings and then I'm done. The first one, more synchrony is not always better for attachment development and maintenance, right? So imagine a situation when the child is upset and starts crying. Do we want the mother to start or the father to start crying as well? Or keep crying for 10 minutes together, right? It can be a quite emotional experience and sometimes it helps, but usually it's not that helpful, right? We want the mother to be more positive and to draw the child out from the negativity. So in that sense, especially in negative situations, more synchrony might actually not really be the best thing because the negative emotion just keeps spreading. And the second thing, we have already heard it in the first talk, as parents, we don't need to be constantly present and always on. It suffices to be good enough, right? We don't have to be attuned all the time with the kids because it becomes intrusive and overstimulatory, and that kind of synchrony is not going to be helpful, right? Positive synchrony during mutually playful situations is very good for development, but we shouldn't be always in sync and always together try to attune to the child. And that brings me to the end of my talk. I hope I was able to explain how we conceptualize attachment these days from a social neuroscience perspective, and to give you a few general tips how we can ensure that our children grow up with a healthy brain and with ideally more secure attachment. Thank you so much for your attention.